Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the lecture on the respiratory system. So let's begin discussing the respiratory system. Well, we discussed so far the circulatory system that is able to circulate oxygen for oxidative phosphorylation and aerobic respiration. Why do we need oxygen? We need oxygen in order to obtain, why do we need oxygen? This process of aerobic respiration and oxidative phosphorylation. Why do we need oxygen? Why do we breathe oxygen? Why do we rely on aerobic respiration and oxidative phosphorylation? Please take out a plain sheet of paper and write everything on the whiteboard. Who can remember for us what's the significance? Why is oxygen so essential that if you have hypoxia, tissue is going to die? Because oxygen is going to give us ATP. And why do we need ATP? Why do we need ATP? In order to power the enzymes. Enzymes do not work for free. Enzymes catalyze reactions that would otherwise take thousands of years to take place. So if we need an enzyme to accelerate for us a reaction or catalyze enzymes, catalyze a reaction that sustains life. Who can give me an example of a reaction that enzymes would catalyze to sustain life? Metabolism. How about metabolism? Okay, an example would be metabolism. So metabolism is essential for life. If you can carry out metabolism. Another example, what's another example of a reaction besides metabolism that the enzymes would catalyze in order to sustain your life? How about homeostasis? Homeostasis. Homeostasis. All of this thermoregulation, glycemic index, and also your regulating the tension, the blood tension, U tension. We don't want hypertension or hypotension. All of this homeostasis. If it wasn't for the enzymes, if it was not for the enzymes, you will never be able to have metabolism, and you will never be able to have homeostasis, and you will not have life, and you will die. So ATP powers the enzymes, and oxygen gives us ATP. So oxygen, number one, gives us ATP. ATP powers the enzymes, and the enzymes catalyze for us life-sustaining reactions such as metabolism and homeostasis. Is that part clear? Any questions? Okay. Now, your respiratory system. I discussed with you in the past. If you ask a student, what is the job of hemoglobin? They will tell you it transports oxygen. Why is that half of the answer? This is not a complete answer. It's a partial answer to say that hemoglobin is important for the transport of oxygen from the lung to the tissues. Why is that half? You know the train has two lines, an uptown and a downtown line. Every train has an uptown and downtown line. So hemoglobin transports oxygen from the lung to the tissue. And once it gets to the tissue, what does hemoglobin do? It comes back home empty-handed. It comes back with carbon dioxide. So you have to understand that the respiratory system is important because it's responsible for, number one, plus providing oxygen for aerobic respiration, oxidative phosphorylation, to provide ATP, power the enzymes, and also to remove the harmful carbon dioxide. Those are two essential jobs. You can't do half. You can't do one job and leave the other. You can't have a respiratory system responsible for replenishing oxygen, but I have a respiratory system that cannot get rid of carbon dioxide. And that's what we're going to learn today about COPD. COPD patients, they have no problem bringing in oxygen. They take a deep breath, oxygen comes in, filling the lungs. So this part, they take care of that 100%. So where is their problem? The problem is to exhale, get out the carbon dioxide. Because we're going to learn today that those little bubbles, those little balloons, known as the alveoli, these alveoli, they have the ability, like a balloon, to stretch out. And they also have the ability to recoil, empty. So they fill with oxygen and they exhale and get rid of carbon dioxide. You will see that patients who suffer from emphysema, patients who suffer from emphysema, they lose the elastic recoil. So imagine you have a balloon that you fill it with air and it fills completely with air. But when you let go, the air is not coming out because the balloon cannot recoil. It cannot stretch. That's emphysema. That's nicotine. Nicotine is going to destroy the elastic recoil of the alveoli. So the alveoli has no problem stretching, but it cannot exit the carbon dioxide. So that's the problem here. People who have COPD, they are rich in oxygen, but they are also rich in what? In carbon dioxide. So people who have COPD, they are rich in carbon dioxide because they can't get it out. So they always suffer from what? If you have high carbon dioxide in your blood, what is that going to lead to? High carbon dioxide in the blood is going to mix with water. And when you mix carbon dioxide with water, what are you going to get? If you mix carbon dioxide with water, what are you going to get? I'm sorry? It's not bicarbonate. It's carbonic acid. Carbonic acid. Carbonic acid. This is very important. So why do people that suffer from COPD always have a lot of carbonic acid in their blood? They can't get rid of it. So it keeps on saturating in the blood. And it mixes with water, and there's a lot of carbonic acid. And that's not the end. If you have a lot of carbonic acid in the blood, what does that lead to? If you have a lot of carbonic acid in your blood, as a nurse, what should you be afraid of? Will happen? How about acidosis? Acidosis. And that's going to lead to death. Acidosis. And that's going to lead to death. Okay? Acidosis. And that's going to lead to death. This is very, very important. So, why does acidosis lead to death? Why does acidosis lead to death? Because you know your blood pH. What is the blood pH? Blood pH must equal to what? Yes. So the blood pH must be between 7.35. So let's make a spectrum. You have 7.35 up to 7.45. You have a range. It's called the physiological pH range. Your pH is not one value, it's not one number. It's a range. You can fluctuate up and down. When you exercising, your blood is going to become more acidic or basic. It's going to become more acidic. And it depends on the food you eat. Some people drink milk as basic. Some people drink lemon juice as acidic. But that's under control because you keep on fluctuating, going down and up, down and up. But hey, you cannot go below 7.35 because that's going to become what now? Acidosis. If you go below 7.35, that's acidosis. If you go above 7.45, that's called what? Alkalosis. That's called alkalosis. Yes?
But you're saying that if there's more CO2, it's going to cause more acidosis.
Yeah.
But if people that they work out, they don't have like more oxygen coming in, it shouldn't be building like alkalosis then?
Can you say it again?
Because you said a moment ago that people that work out, that would be acidosis. But I would think when you work out, there would be more oxygen.
Okay. When you're working out, do you gasp more oxygen? Do you want to bring in more oxygen? Or do you want less oxygen?
I want more oxygen.
You want more oxygen. Why you want more oxygen? Because the oxygen you have has already been burned for your skeletal muscle. So how are you able to run on a treadmill for 1 hour? Because the skeletal muscle is burning all the metabolism. The metabolism breaking down glucose, carbs to get ATP. That is metabolism. Breaking down lipids and fats to get ATP. Breaking down proteins to get ATP. So you need ATP. So, and to get ATP, you need oxygen to burn combustion with oxygen. So that's why when you're running, you burn so much oxygen that you start hyperventilating to bring in, replenish more oxygen because all of the oxygen has been burned in your skeletal muscle. Is that clear? So whenever you're exercising, you're depleting oxygen and you're increasing carbon dioxide because carbon dioxide is waste. An indicator for oxygen burning is carbon dioxide starting to rise. That's how you gas in your car. When you go pump gas, it doesn't the fume come out from the exhaust. That shows you that the gas has been burned. So the carbon dioxide increase when oxygen, they are like a seesaw. They are like a seesaw. If carbon dioxide is low, that means oxygen is high. If carbon dioxide is high, it means oxygen is low. They will never be like that, the same. Carbon dioxide equals to oxygen. They are always enemies. So you burn oxygen in order to sustain life. That's why we have aerobic respiration and oxidative phosphorylation. This concept is very clear. So we will learn today that your respiratory system has two jobs. Don't say to bring oxygen to the tissue only, but also to remove carbon dioxide, otherwise we will have acidosis. And you know the people who smoke cigarette, people who have emphysema, chronic bronchitis, they have a problem getting rid of carbon dioxide. So that's why their blood is very acidic. Is that clear? So that's one job of the respiratory system. They come together, bring in oxygen and removing carbon dioxide. That's the first job. Another job for your respiratory system is your phonation, your speech. Why wasn't I able to give lecture last week? Why wasn't I able to talk? So you see, your respiratory system is essential and central for your speech. Imagine you are a singer and they don't do that nowadays. They have a DJ, but back in the day for the wedding, you have to have a singer. You know the singer in the microphone. Imagine you're sick and the people already paid you and you're coming to the wedding, and you're, what a wonderful world. They're gonna hate you, they're gonna sue you. So now you learn that your respiratory system is important for speech, not just your life, for speaking. You speak to somebody and say, oh, that person is sick today. So don't forget that. Your respiratory system is important for your communication. Okay? So now this is the most important thing you have to take away. The relationship between your respiratory system protecting you from all of the acidosis, the potential acidosis. And the lung is non-regenerative tissue. Okay, you smoking a cigarette, you have lung fibrosis, you keep getting a lot of flus in the cold, like the people who jump in the cold water in the winter, and they are young, and they're foolish, and they don't know that they keep getting fibrosis. At some point, you will learn if something is wrong with the alveoli, you can never go back. If the alveoli is damaged, you can never regenerate new alveoli. If your skin is crushed, you get new skin. No problem. But if the alveoli is damaged, you need a lung transplant. You need a new lung. New lung. It's a non-regenerative tissue. So, now, let's rewind and go back now to break apart. So this ATP, by the way, I gave you an example of the importance of ATP. ATP is important for enzymes. That's it? ATP is only important for enzymes? There's a lot of channels. Channels that rely on ATP. The sodium potassium ATPase? It's an enzyme too. It's a channel and an enzyme. But it needs ATP. So if you don't have ATP, you will die immediately, quickly. So now let us go back and break apart our respiratory system. Okay. Now, so we have the respiratory system is divided into structure, anatomy, and physiology, function. Now, what is the structure of our respiratory system? Well, the respiratory system, remember, whenever we're talking about structure, we're talking about the organization. So remember, if I tell you a building has a basement, a first and a second floor, that's all I told you. That's just the structure. A basement, a first and a second floor. Did I tell you the basement is a parking lot? Did I tell you the basement is where the cafeteria is? Did I tell you the basement is where the storage warehouse? So I never told you the function. So I just told you the structure. The first floor, is it HR, financial aid, bursar, advisors, administration? Is the second floor where they have the labs, the laboratories, and the lecture halls? So I never told you the function of each floor. I just told you the structure. So now let's look at the structure of our respiratory system. The respiratory system has the nose, and it has the mouth or the oral cavity. You know, you breathe with both nasal cavity, oral cavity. Then you have the pharynx. Then you have the larynx. Then you have the trachea. Then you have the bronchioles, and then you have lastly the alveoli. The bronchioles, you have the tertiary bronchioles, then you have the secondary bronchioles, and then you have the primary bronchioles, and then you have the alveoli. That's your entire respiratory tract. That is your entire respiratory. This is the whole entire respiratory tract. Is that clear? Okay, so air flows in unidirectionally to the alveoli and then returns back in the opposite direction. So, there's something you need to know. That up to the larynx, that is considered the upper respiratory tract. From the nose up to the larynx, 1 nose, 2 oral cavity, 3 pharynx, 4 larynx. That's the upper respiratory tract. So when we say that there is an upper respiratory tract infection, it involves the nose, the oral cavity, the pharynx, and the larynx. But from the trachea, number 5, and the bronchioles, number 6, and the old alveoli, number 7, that is the lower respiratory tract. Lower respiratory tract. Lower respiratory tract. Any questions? So now we know the upper and the lower respiratory tract. So we have, the building is divided into 2 parts. An upper respiratory tract and a lower respiratory tract. That's an anatomical classification. So according to the anatomy, we have 2 subdivisions: an upper respiratory tract, upper respiratory tract, and we have a lower respiratory tract. lower respiratory tract. Is that clear? Now, when you look at the physiology, what are the functions of your respiratory tract? It has two functions, 1 and 2. The same way it has two structures, 1 upper respiratory tract, 2 lower respiratory tract. There is definitely two functions. What are the two functions? The two functions of the respiratory tract is conduction. There is a conduction zone, and then there is a respiration zone. There's two zones. There's the conduction zone and the respiration zone. What does conduction mean? What does conduction mean? Conduction means passage of air, humidification, filtering, cleaning. You're conducting the air. So, what's your conduction zone? Your conduction zone is all of this. Your nose is a conduction zone. Your oral cavity is a conduction zone. Your pharynx is a conduction zone. Your larynx is a conduction zone. Your trachea is a conduction zone. Bronchioles are all conduction zones. You see, 6 out of the 7 regions of your respiratory tract are conduction zones. So they're just responsible for passing down the air. So conduction zone includes the nose, oral cavity, pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchioles. So all of this here, nose, oral cavity, pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchioles, everything except who? Except the alveoli. That's all a conduction zone. In your respiratory zone, you have only one thing, and that is the alveoli. How amazing is that? So the respiratory zone, so we described what the conduction zone means. Conduction zone means is conducting air, passing it down, filtering it, purifying air, purifying the air. So we're trying to get the air to be humid, filtered, clean, pure. All of the respiratory tract is operating in order to pass the air to the queen. You guys see the queen here? That's the queen. That's the most important part of your lung, the alveoli. Once you get to the alveoli, then you have reached the respiratory zone. What does respiration mean? It means gas exchange. Gas exchange. And when I say gas exchange, I mean oxygen flowing from the lung into the blood, and the opposite, carbon dioxide flowing from the blood into the lung. Then the lung is going to throw out the carbon dioxide into the air and bring in from the air oxygen. So you see, Oxygen comes from the air into the lung, and from the lung into the blood, and from the blood into the tissue. So oxygen is traveling 3 times. Once from air into the lung. When you inhale, take a deep breath. Oxygen goes from air into the lung. Then oxygen goes from the lung into your red blood cells. Into your red blood cells. Then the red blood cells take oxygen from the blood into the tissue for aerobic respiration. And what? For aerobic respiration and what? And oxidative phosphorylation. And then we burn the oxygen and we get carbon dioxide out. So carbon dioxide leaves the tissue as metabolic waste into the blood, red blood cells. Then the red blood cells take the carbon dioxide into the lung, and then the lung sends out the carbon dioxide into the air. Into the air. Into the air. Any questions? Any questions? Any questions? You need to know those trips. Oxygen goes from air to the lung, from the lung to red blood cell, from red blood cell to the tissue. And then oxygen is burned, recycled. Oxygen is burned, recycled. And then carbon dioxide goes to the blood. Carbon dioxide goes from the blood to the lung, and from the lung to the air. Any questions? Hold on, I'm gonna move. Just be patient. Any questions? Okay. Alrighty. So I'm gonna ask a question now. What is the difference between internal respiration and external respiration? Well, both are respiration. Both are respiration. One is internal, one is external. Which one is an external respiration? Which one is an internal respiration? So this here is internal respiration. When you have the red blood cell delivering the oxygen to when the red blood cell delivering the oxygen to the tissue. This is called internal. Write this down. That's internal respiration. That's called internal respiration. External respiration is this one here. Is when the lung is exchanging with air. So the lung sends out the oxygen to the air, and the lung sends out the carbon dioxide to the air and brings in oxygen to the lung. This is called external. This is called external respiration. Everybody got the difference between internal and external respiration? Okay. And now you know that your entire respiratory tract, the vast majority of it, 6 out of 7 compartments are for doing what? For conduction. passage, humidification, filtration, cleaning, and purifying. And only the alveolar, these alveoli, these are air sacs. The alveoli are air sacs. Alveoli are air sacs, like balloons. When they stretch open, they fill with what? When they stretch open, when they expand, when the alveoli expand and then they shrink. They expand and then they shrink. When the alveoli expand, they full of what? Oxygen. And when they recoil and relax, they expel out what? Carbon dioxide. And we need both. We're going to learn about diseases where the lung can full of air, but it cannot get rid of carbon dioxide, which leads to acidosis. Is that clear? Okay. This is our lung, and we see now and this is our lung, and this is our heart. And this is our tissue. That's our tissue. And every dot represents the cells. So this is the tissue made up of multiple cells. And this is the heart. Okay, so what happens as a first step is that blood rich in oxygen goes to the tissue. So blood that is rich in oxygen and poor in carbon dioxide goes to the tissue, and then the tissue sends out blood that is poor in oxygen and rich in carbon dioxide. And then the heart pumps out the blood that is rich in carbon dioxide and poor in oxygen to the lungs, and the lungs expel out carbon dioxide and bring in oxygen, and then the oxygen goes from the lung into the heart. Oxygen rich blood goes from the lung, and this is carbon dioxide poor blood, and then you see how the circulation is. You see how the circulation is. So where is the internal respiration? Internal respiration is right here. Internal respiration. Exchanging of oxygen with the tissue and removal of carbon dioxide. And external respiration is here. When the lungs throw out carbon dioxide and bring in oxygen. Is that clear? Okay, so now you need to understand the relationship between the volume and pressure. So if you look at the movement of your chest, when you breathe, when you're inhaling, does your chest get wider when you're taking a deep breath in, or does your chest get wider when you're exhaling? When inhaling. So when you're inhaling, the volume of your chest becomes wider. And when you're exhaling, the volume of your chest becomes smaller. That's called Boyle's law. That is known as Boyle's law. What does Boyle's law say? Boyle's law says that at constant temperature, meaning when the temperature doesn't change, then the relationship between the volume and the pressure is inverse. So at constant temperature, the relationship between volume and pressure is inverse proportion. Wrap your head around this law. The law says that at constant temperature, like physiological temperature, like your homeostatic temperature, 37 degrees Celsius, when you're at constant temperature, the relationship between the volume and pressure is inversely proportional. So what does that really mean? If you look into this experiment here, let's say we have this chamber here. We have a chamber. And we put in the chamber a piston. That's a piston. That is a piston that we have placed in the chamber. And we have molecules, we have gas molecules floating inside. Now, if I put down the piston, if I push down my piston down, so now the piston looks like that. The piston now looks like this. What happened to the volume compared to before? Let's say this happened at 6 o'clock, and then at 6:30 p.m., I push down the piston. What do you notice happened? What do you notice has happened here compared to before? What do you think has happened compared to before? What do you think happened? Well, look at the volume before. That's the volume, right? That's the volume. That's V1. That's the volume at 6 p.m. That's the volume at 6 p.m. Now let's look at the volume at 6:30. What happened to the volume? It got smaller. So the volume dropped. What do you think happens to the pressure? Because remember, the temperature is the same. The temperature here is 30 degrees Celsius, and here is also 30 degrees Celsius. Nothing really changed. 6 o'clock, 6:30. The temperature is the same. So according to Boyle's law, at constant temperature, the relationship between the volume and the pressure is inversely proportional. So now look, my temperature is the same. But what happened to my volume? It decreased. So if my volume decreased, my temperature is constant. What do you think is going to happen to my pressure?
Increase.
My pressure is going to increase. Excellent. Now you got it. Now let's do the opposite. Let's say now I move on to 7 o'clock. I go to 7 o'clock. And at 7 o'clock, I did this. At 7 o'clock, I did this. I pulled back the piston. But my temperature is the same, 30 degrees Celsius. That's my temperature, 30 degrees Celsius. And what time is it now? It's 7 p.m. So, what happens in the third time? What happened to the volume? The volume increased. So here, if the volume increased, while the temperature is constant, what do you think happens to the pressure?
Decrease.
The pressure is going to decrease. This is the law that you need to know for Boyle's law. Students, when you ask them in a short answer, in the lab practical, state or write Boyle's law. They say the relationship between volume and pressure is inversely proportional. Is that true or false? All that they wrote was the relationship between volume and pressure is inversely proportional. True or false? False. Because there's a condition that needs to be met. The temperature has to be constant. This is wrong. To say that the relationship between volume and pressure is inversely proportional is wrong. The relationship between volume and pressure is inversely proportional only if the temperature is constant. Now, why is this law here important for our breathing? Why is Boyle's law at constant temperature, the relationship between volume and pressure is inversely proportional? Why do we care about that in breathing? Well, if you remember from blood, when we did the blood lecture, when we did circulation, we said that fluids move only from where to where? From what? High concentration? We didn't say concentration. From high? What kind of gradient? There is many gradients. There is thermal gradient. There is concentration gradient. There is chemical gradient. There is electrical gradient. There is pressure gradient. What kind of gradient? Pressure. That's why we have the heart pump. So the blood moves from the heart to the legs because pressure is highest in the heart and lowest in the leg. So we said fluids move from an area of a high pressure to an area of a low pressure. That's the law. Now, is air fluid or not?
No.
Remember when we talked about fluids, we said fluids are either liquids or gases. So blood is a liquid fluid, and air is a gaseous fluid. And the law says, did the law say only liquids move from area of high pressure to low pressure? Did the law only say liquids move from high pressure to low pressure? Or did it say fluids? Fluids. So that includes gases too. So now if we look into your breathing, this is the air, atmospheric air. Atmospheric air. That's the air in the atmosphere, outside your body. This is the air outside your body. You bring in air to the inside of your lungs. So air moved in. True or false? Look at the arrow. The arrow says that the movement when you inhale, air went from where to where? From the atmosphere, from the air. That means the pressure was highest where? Was the pressure highest in the atmosphere or highest in the lung? Was pressure highest in the atmosphere or in the lung? In the atmosphere, because the law is clear. Fluids will never move except from an area of a high pressure to an area of low pressure. So when you inhale, the air went from an area of high pressure, the atmosphere, to an area of low pressure, the lung. That's when you inhale. Now, let's look at what happens when you exhale. Let's look at what happens when you exhale. When you exhale, carbon dioxide left. That's when you exhale. It left the lung and it went into the atmosphere. So those are two directions. So when you exhale, what is the pressure highest?
In the lungs.
In the lungs. So the pressure is highest in the lungs and the pressure is lowest in the air. You really need to know that we have two separate scenarios when we are inhaling the air, when we are inhaling and air is coming in to the lungs, the pressure is highest in the atmosphere and is lowest in the lungs. But when you're exhaling, the pressure is highest in the lungs and is lowest in the atmosphere. So that means the pressure changes. How does the pressure change? Do we change the pressure of air? How does the pressure change? With your rib cage. So now let's go back to this. Let's go back to the pistons. This represents you see your rib cage? See your rib cage. Your rib cage is like a big box. When you are inflating, increasing the volume, the pressure drops. So where do you think the volume the volume increases the most when you're inhaling or exhaling? Inhaling. So the volume goes up and the pressure goes down. And the temperature is constant. So when the pressure went down and the volume went up, air went in. Inhalation. But when you want to exhale, your rib cage, what does it do to the volume of your transverse diameter? What happens to the volume of your transverse diameter when you're exhaling? What happens to it? So it shrink. So the volume, when you're exhaling, the volume shrink down. And the temperature is what? The temperature is constant. And the volume goes down, that means the pressure is? If the volume goes down and the temperature is constant, that means the pressure is high. So now the fluid air is going to move from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. And that's going to be the air, and the air is going to go out. So in your heart, you have a pump that generates pressure. That's in the circulatory system. But in the respiratory system, do you have a pump? You don't have a pump. But you have a volume piston, which is your rib cage and the intercostal muscle. You know the rib steak? Yeah, those ones were not for eating. They were for breathing. So they shrink to decrease volume, increase pressure, so you exhale. Or the animal exhales. And they expand to increase volume at constant temperature, so the pressure is gonna drop and air goes from high pressure to low pressure. Is that clear? That's very important. Okay, so these are the main concepts that we need to know. So now let us go into the PowerPoint slides and look at these concepts in depth. Does anybody have any questions?
No.
Okay. Okay. Everybody go to the PowerPoint. Okay, you can take a 5-minute break, get water, come back. Okay, take a 5-minute break, get water, come back. Yeah. I don't want you to end up like me. You don't drink water, you get dehydrated. Okay, 5 minutes, we start.
Yo, I gotta go. We're supposed to be, so we found it out. She put, yeah, and then she, yeah. So it's an easy one. Yeah, yeah, literally, yeah. And then I'm paper and I'm going to be like that. I wasn't. It's right. That's it. I think that was. But yeah, and then I feel like that's already going to be so that we know I was it's really infection control or my license is so like I'm you know it is.
I don't think that will work out. Okay, who would like to tell us how can breathing represent life? You know the breath of a newborn baby? That represents life. And the last gasp of a dying person. So this shows you the importance of respiration. All the body's processes, directly or indirectly, require ATP. We talked about that. Most ATP synthesis requires oxygen. That's why we say oxidative. What do we name the process? When we utilize oxygen to make ATP, we say that oxidative. Oxidative phosphorylation. It drives the need to breathe, to take in oxygen and eliminate the carbon dioxide. Why do we need to eliminate carbon dioxide? Otherwise, what will happen if we don't eliminate carbon dioxide? If you don't eliminate carbon dioxide, what happens? Acidosis goes on. The respiratory system consists of a system of tubes that deliver the air to the lungs, and then oxygen diffuses into the blood and carbon dioxide diffuses out. We discussed that. The respiratory and cardiovascular systems work together to deliver oxygen to the tissue and remove the carbon dioxide. And the respiratory system and the urinary system collaborate to regulate the acid-base balance. Respiration is the term that is used to refer to the ventilation of the lungs. And remember we said we have two types of respiration. Internal and external respiration. Internal respiration and external respiration. Your respiratory system is important for communication, for speech, and other vocalizations. Also, your respiratory system is important for olfaction. How could the sense of smell be important? To direct you to the side of food, right? You know, how do the animals know where to go and hunt? All of the deer, and it's because they smell. Also, the smell is important to drive you away from danger, right? From the danger. So you smell nitric oxide, you know your stove, the gas in the stove. If you leave it and it starts leaking, do you smell that or no?
Yes.
Actually, it has no smell. But they add to it something corrosive so that it can alarm you and alert you that this is dangerous and that's gonna lead to harm. So it alerts you and alarms you, and that's part of your nose. So that shows you your respiratory system is not only important for gas exchange, not only important for communication, it's also important for olfaction, smelling. Acid-base balance influences the pH of the body fluids. So, when you're running on a treadmill, why do you hyperventilate? Because your body is constantly burning oxygen and building up and depositing and building up and stacking waste of what? Of carbon dioxide. So you're removing the carbon dioxide from the blood. Also, your lung makes angiotensin II. Angiotensin II is an enzyme that is responsible for maintaining blood pressure during times of hypotension. Like when you are dehydrated, or for example, when you are running a marathon. If you're running the marathon and you're so dehydrated, what happens to your blood pressure? You know, you're running the marathon, you're dehydrated, you're sweating, you're losing a lot of water in the sweat. Where is the water coming from? When you're sweating, where is the water coming from? From your blood, from the plasma. Every water, what about the saliva? Where is the saliva coming from? From your blood, from your plasma. How about your cerebrospinal fluid? Where is that coming from? From the blood too, the blood plasma. Your synovial joint fluid. You know your joint has a lot of fluid, synovial fluid. Where is that synovial fluid coming from? It's coming from your blood plasma. So now you're sweating, you're losing a lot of blood plasma in the sweat. What happens to your blood pressure as a result? It drops. So that's why, you see where my mouse is? This enzyme, angiotensin II, is going to come in to conserve blood pressure and prevent water loss. When you are breathing, it also helps propel and push the lymph and blood fluids. During childbirth, defecation, and urination, holding your breath helps ease up the childbirth, helps ease up the defecation, and helps make easy the urination. The principal organs of the respiratory system are the nose, the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, the bronchi, and the lungs. So the incoming air stops in the alveoli, and millions of thin-walled microscopic air sacs are in the alveoli. So you see here, you see what I meant, the conducting zone. Who can tell me what the conducting zone is? What does the conducting zone refers to? We discussed that. It's the
six start from nose.
I'm sorry? I can't hear what you said.
Conduction is the sixth part.
The sixth part, the sixth out of the seven part of the respiratory tract, what happens in there?
Start from nose.
I'm sorry?
It start from nose. Nose.
It starts from the nose and then ends at the bronchioles. But what happens? And I'm not saying where, I'm saying what happens in the conduction zone. The filtration, purification, and the passage of the air. But is there any respiration? Is there any gas exchange? That is known as dead space. That's known as the dead space. The respiratory zone of the respiratory system consists of the alveoli and gas exchange regions. If you look where my mouse is. The upper respiratory tract in the head and in the neck. That shows you nose through the larynx. This is known as the upper respiratory tract. The lower respiratory tract represents the trachea through the alveoli of the lungs. Any questions? Now, let's look at this diagram. This diagram shows us that the nose has external openings and internal opening, right? The external openings are known as the nostrils, and the internal openings are known as the choanae. Choanae or choanae. We will see them in a little bit. Now, your nose is a combination of bone and cartilage. Your nose is a combination of bone and cartilage. And that's how people modify with surgery, plastic surgery, because it's cartilage. If it was bone, they cannot modify that. And we see those are the lateral cartilages, the septic cartilages, and alar cartilages. So the extending part is cartilage, and the inner part is bone. Now, you see that the nose has external openings and internal openings on the inside. So at the beginning of the nasal cavity, there is a small dilated chamber just inside the nostrils. It is lined with stratified squamous epithelium. And there is this hair, you know the hairs inside your nose? They are like the mop, the bathroom mop. They are mopping and trapping. You know the air is full of pollutants, dust, mites, pet dander, microbes. So it filters it like a strainer and traps it. The nose is also rich in mucosa. You know the mouth strap? The mouth strap has glue on the surface. So this glue on the surface is responsible for trapping any microbes, trapping any bacteria, trapping any form of infectious microbe. And you see now there is an internal open space. You see, these are the meatuses. Those are air trapping regions. You don't want the air to flow down into the respiratory tracts very rapidly because the air needs to be heated up, humidified. Because it's too cold or too hot, it's going to hurt your respiratory tract. So you see now, this is the See, those are the meatuses, and you see this is the external openings, and those are the internal openings. And when you look at if you immediately leave the nose, what do we have in order? If you look at the order of the upper respiratory tract we discussed, you have the nose, and after the nose, what do we have? We have the the oral cavity, and after the oral cavity, we have the pharynx. The pharynx itself, you see how they nicely have it in yellow color, pink, and blue? Yellow represents the nasopharynx. Pink represents the oral pharynx. And blue represents laryngeal pharynx. The pharynx in the throat is a muscular funnel extending 5 inches from the choana to the larynx. You see, you have nasopharynx because it's close to the nasal cavity. Oral pharynx, and lastly is the laryngeal pharynx. That's where the larynx is the voice box. It evolved to help in the speech. So you see, the larynx is the voice box. You know we have nicknames. You've learned in Anatomy and Physiology 1 that the scapula is called the collarbone. No, the scapula is the shoulder blade. The clavicle is the collarbone. The calvarium is known as the skull cap. The patella is known as the kneecap. The trachea is known as the windpipe. The larynx is known as the voice box, primarily to keep food and drink out of the airway. You don't want any food to leak into your lungs, so that's the responsibility of the larynx. That's the main responsibility of the larynx. People think that larynx are important only for speech. Yes, larynx are important for speech and phonation and production of sound. But primarily they are important for food, to keep food and drink out of the airway. And you see now the larynx has a lot of cartilage. You know this Adam's apple? This Adam's apple represents the thyroid, a combination of the thyroid and cricoid cartilage. And what makes it grow really hard? Testosterone. That's why men have prominent this Adam's apple, women don't have it. Obviously they do, but it is not as prominent as men. But this Adam's apple in men starts to begin after the boyhood ends, when you become a young adult. And the reason is the testosterone. Females don't have a lot of testosterone, only a little bit. Females have an essential hormone known as estrogen. So what is responsible for making the Adam's apple, this thyroid cartilage, cricoid cartilage, hypertrophy and increase? Testosterone. So you see, this is the epiglottis, and that shows you the vestibular fold, and this is the glottis inside to prevent any leakage of food or impaction of food or any foreign bodies inside the trachea. You see, this is the adduction of the vocal cord, and that is the abduction to allow the opening and closing. Trachea is the windpipe. It is a rigid tube about 12 centimeters long, and it is found anterior to the esophagus. And it is made up of cartilage. The trachea is predominantly cartilage and faces posteriorly towards the esophagus. The trachealis muscle spans the opening in the rings, and there is a gap in a C shape. It allows room for the esophagus to expand as swallowed food is passing by. So that shows you the thyroid cartilage, and that's the cricoid cartilage, and you see the C-shaped cartilage. You see, that's right here is the C shape, and what connects the C, the two edges of the C shape, is a muscle here. What's the name of this muscle? Trachealis. Excellent, trachealis muscle. That's the tracheal epithelium. And in tracheostomy, they place this device here to allow for the phonation due to some debilitating subglottic stenosis. Now, if you look at the two lungs, they do not look the same. You see now, both lungs have this fissure on the bottom here. Is this the left lung or right lung? Where my mouse is? Is this left lung or right lung? Yeah, so you see the left lung has a fissure here. You see where my mouse is? And the right lung also has the same fissure here. What's the name of this fissure? That's the oblique fissure. But only the right lung has an additional fissure here. What do we call that? Horizontal fissure. Does the left lung has a horizontal fissure? It doesn't. So that means the right lung, due to the horizontal fissure, is divided into how many? Is divided into how many regions? 3 regions. And on the bottom here is divided into how many regions? 2 regions. The hilum is a slit through which the lung receives the main bronchus, the blood vessels, and the lymphatic. Because the lung is a tissue, is a breathing tissue. You remember how we discussed the coronary circulation and how the blood has to perfuse the muscle and provide it with oxygen and remove the carbon dioxide so the muscle tissue does not die. The lung also needs, in the hilum, blood vessels and lymphatics and nerves. That shows you a transverse cross-section through the thoracic cavity. Lungs are crowded by adjacent organs. So you see that the right lung, we said, has 3 lobes. What is the fissure that allows the right lung to have an additional lobe, 3rd lobe? What do we call that? What's the name of the fissure that is found on the right lung that allows for an additional lobe?
Horizontal fissure.
Horizontal fissure. Excellent. What's the name of the fissure that is found in both left and right lung?
Oblique.
Oblique fissure. So those are like lab practical questions. You see oblique fissure, and then is the horizontal fissure. Now we move down the trachea into the bronchial tree. The bronchial tree is a tube system. There is a main primary bronchi, and that is the one that is just barely branching off of the trachea. So the right bronchus is slightly wider and more vertical compared to the left. Then you see now, this is the histology of the lung. And the lung has alveoli, and please remember that this alveolar air sacs, they have squamous type 1 alveolar cells, and those are thin road cells that allow for rapid gas diffusion between the alveolus and the bloodstream. They cover 95% of the alveolus surface area. Please remember that. Please remember that the squamous type 1, those type 1 alveolar cells, they participate in rapid gas exchange, and they cover 95% of the alveolus surface area. You see, now we have type 2 alveolar cells, and those secrete surfactant. Why would we need something like that? Why would we need something like that?
To work against each other.
So why do you need a surfactant? You know the alveoli are responsible for what? For stretching and expanding and recoiling. So you will need a surfactant to moisten and allow the elastic, malleable recoil of those alveoli. In fact, there is a disease you will learn. This disease will harden. I talked about that in the beginning. It will harden and stiffen, make really tough, really stiff outer edges of the alveoli, and it's going to decrease the amount of the secretion of the surfactant. It's like a lotion surfactant that allows for the elastic recoil. You need to know the name of the cells that secrete the surfactant. What's the name of the cells who secrete the surfactant? Those are the, sometimes they call them great, sometimes they call them type 2 alveolar cells. So on the NCLEX, they may say great alveolar cells or type 2 alveolar cells or both. Great type 2 alveolar cells. You know the answer. And if they ask you what is type 1 alveolar cell responsible for, what's the answer? There you go. That's important for rapid gas exchange. Which cells are more predominant? Those are the type 1 squamous. So we have squamous type 1 alveolar cells, and we have great type 2 alveolar cells. Those make up about 5% only. They secrete the surfactant. Those are the great type 2 alveolar cells. They are cuboidal cells, make up about 5% of the alveolar surface, and they secrete the pulmonary surfactant. You really need to understand that, pulmonary surfactant. So it's a mixture of lipids and proteins that coat the surface of the alveoli in order to prevent them from collapsing. In order to prevent them from collapsing during the exhalation. An unborn baby starts to make surfactant at about 26 weeks of pregnancy. If the baby is born prematurely before 37 weeks of pregnancy, so you see now the unborn baby at about 26 weeks of pregnancy is going to start to make it. But if it's born prematurely, the baby may not have enough surfactant. So not enough surfactant is going to result in tiny alveoli, and they're going to collapse. So this surfactant is a big deal. So people who have, we will learn about diseases where the surfactant is not secreted, or where there's an enzyme that shreds the outer surfaces or destroys the outer surface of the alveoli, leading to alveoli becoming more stiff. So that's the alveoli. See that the alveolar sac looks like a bubble, and the air flows in. You see the bronchiole, and right around the alveoli, what do we have? Right around the alveoli, we have capillaries that allow for the exchange of carbon dioxide to go inside the alveoli so it can be pushed out, and for oxygen to diffuse into the bloodstream. So that's the great alveolar cell that secretes surfactant, and that's the alveolar macrophage. Carbon dioxide leaves and hit oxygen goes inside the blood. Now, it's very important to talk about the pleura. We talked about the pleura. I believe you guys went over it during the Anatomy and Physiology 1. Do you recall that you guys in Anatomy and Physiology 1 went over the covering? You know, all the viscera, you know, the viscera in your body, the brain, it has meninges covering it. The heart, it has a sac protecting and covering it. What do we call that? The pericardium. The lung has a protective balloon around it. What do we call that? Pleura. And the peritoneum, the around your abdomen, there is a protective sac. What do we call that? Peritoneum. Now, the pleura, we discussed that all the pleura are full, the pleura and the pericardium, all of these protective sacs are not empty. They're not full of air. They are full of water, protein, nutrients, electrolytes, gases, and the bacteria love to infect and eat all of that delicious stuff. So there's always diseases like pericarditis, there is diseases like pleuritis, and so on. The serous membrane that covers the lungs, there is a parietal pleura adheres to the mediastinum, the inner surface of the rib cage and the superior surface of the diaphragm. The pleural cavity, the potential space between the pleura. Normally no room between the membranes, but contains a film of slippery pleural fluid. The functions of the pleura and the pleural fluid are to reduce the friction, to protect from trauma, create pressure gradient like lower pressure, that the atmospheric pressure will assist the lung in the inflation, and prevents spread of infection from one organ in the mediastinum to others. Breathing, pulmonary ventilation, that consists of inspiration and expiration, known as exhaling. So one complete cycle of respiration is represented by inspiration and expiration. So there's two types of respiration. There's quiet respiration, and that's when you're at rest, compared to the forced respiration, that's deep, rapid breathing. So the flow of air in and out of the lung depends on a pressure difference between the air within the lungs and outside the body. Respiratory muscles change the lung volumes and create difference in pressure relative to the atmosphere. Intercostal muscles. Those are the muscles that are responsible for what? I talked about that earlier. So we eat them in ribeye steak. But they're not just for eating. They are for expanding and contracting. Don't forget that. So you have internal intercostals and external intercostals. You see, those are the external intercostals on the outside. And those are the internal intercostals, and those are the external intercostals. So they stretch out to increase the volume, meaning the pressure is going to drop. That means air is going in or out? In. So I can ask you a question about that on the lab practice. Describe what happens in exhalation. You know, in exhalation, air flows out. And because air flows out, air moves from the lung into the atmosphere. So the directionality flow is from in to out. And we know that air is a fluid, and fluids do not move except from an area of a high pressure to an area of a low pressure. So I exhale, that means air went from in to out. That means pressure had to be highest on the inside, meaning the volume on the inside was the lowest because the rib cage, contract, squeeze all the air out. So during inhalation, the diaphragm also acts like the internal and external intercostal muscles. So the diaphragm contract. What does it mean when the diaphragm contract? When we say diaphragm contract, it means that it moves down. Contract meaning that the diaphragm moves down. So when the diaphragm moves down, what happens to the volume? What happens to the volume?
The volume of the lungs.
Yes.
Increases.
It increases because it contracted down, but the diaphragm relaxes, meaning it returns back to its original spot. You really need to know that whenever you hear the word, the diaphragm contracted, it means that the diaphragm moved down. When the diaphragm moves down, it means the whole volume of the thorax went up or down. It went up, meaning the volume increased, because you pull down the diaphragm. So the volume increased, pressure drops, I'm breathing in, inhaling. But when I'm exhaling, I relax. So the diaphragm, I relax my diaphragm, the diaphragm goes right back to where it was. Diaphragm descends and increases the depth of the thoracic cavity. No rhythmic pacemaker cells for respiration, as in the heart. So there is no autorhythmic pacemaker cells for respiration, as in the heart. So this slide is teaching us that your nervous system is responsible for your breathing rate, because your nervous system integrates, processes, controls all of the sensory input. For example, what makes you hyperventilate? Like that. It's because your brain knows that there are chemoreceptors in your blood. What do chemoreceptors do? Chemoreceptors, they taste the blood. Chemoreceptors taste the blood for acidity. So when the acidity goes high, a signal is sent to the brain. Then the brain is going to send an output signal to your intercostal muscles to stretch and contract more rapidly, to expel out this carbon dioxide, to save us from acidosis. Is that clear? So you see, breathing depends on the repetitive stimulation of the respiratory muscles from the brain. So that's why, when they hang somebody in execution, when they sever the spinal cord, or when the brain ceases to function, who's going to send the neural stimulation? You guys went over the muscular system in Anatomy and Physiology 1. You went over the end motor plates. And you saw in the end motor plate that it is the action potential propagating down the nerve axon to the synaptic terminal, leading to the release of acetylcholine Then acetylcholine binds postsynaptic receptors, leading to the depolarization and motor plate potential, and that causes the release of calcium and the contraction. So your nerve is the cause for the muscle contraction. Why are the people who are paralyzed have really thin legs? Why do they have really thin legs? Because the nerve is not stimulating the muscle. So when the nerve is not stimulating the muscle, what happens? There is a loss. If you don't use it, you lose it. So if you don't stimulate the muscle with the action potential, the muscle is going to deteriorate. So external intercostals and the diaphragm, it descends and increases the depth of the thoracic cavity. And we see that there are respiratory groups known as the pontine respiratory groups, and there is the ventral respiratory group. This is found in your medulla oblongata in the brain. So the medulla is going to regulate. What is the medulla going to regulate? How does your medulla in the brain regulate your breathing rate? So the medulla is a center in your brain that receives input. The acid level, carbonic acid, is too high. This person is exercising. This person is running the marathon. So now what happens? The medulla has to respond with a negative feedback reflex. And the negative feedback reflex is going to increase the thoracic intercostal, internal intercostal, and internal intercostal rate of firing, causing the shunting, removal of carbon dioxide in order to save your blood from acidosis. So hyperventilation is anxiety-triggered state in which breathing is so rapid that it expels carbon dioxide from the body faster than produced. So it can be brought under control by having the person rebreathe the expired carbon dioxide from the paper bag. What happens to somebody who hyperventilates for no reason? Let's say I just start for 1 minute, go like this. For 1 minute, non-stop, for no reason. I'm not running the marathon, I'm not running on a treadmill, I'm just exhaling, hyperventilating so rapidly. What's going to happen to my blood pH?
Alkalosis.
It's going to be alkalosis because I got now rid of way too much what? Carbon dioxide that I should. And carbon dioxide left, it means that carbonic acid went up or down. If you're hyperventilating, carbonic acid levels go up or down. Carbonic acid levels go down. So you'll suffer from alkalosis. So how to save that kind of person? Put a paper bag in their nose and mouth. So now, when they exhale carbon dioxide, they inhale it right back. So that increases the levels of carbon dioxide. Is that clear? Now, what is this showing you? This figure is showing you the blood tasters. They taste the blood. They taste the blood for what? For carbon dioxide. They want to see if we have enough sufficient amount of carbon dioxide. And you see that they are found in the aortic bodies and the carotid sinuses. You see carotid and aortic bodies. Those are the aortic bodies, and those are the carotid bodies. Those are large arteries above the heart, and they have a lot of chemoreceptors that constantly detect if carbon dioxide levels go up or down. Okay. Now, you have a direct control of your breathing. Like, for example, you can stop yourself from breathing. Have you ever tried that? You try to stop, but you reach a point, if you stop breathing for too long, that means you will not have enough what in your blood. You will not have enough oxygen. You have
Not in substance.
more carbon dioxide building up. Then at that point, your nervous system, your autonomic nervous system, a lot of students say automatic nervous system. It's not true, even though it does work automatically. But it's not called automatic, it's called autonomic because it's autonomous, works on its own, secret in the background, you don't see it, invisible, and it overrides you. So you stop breathing, then out of nowhere you find yourself breathing. So why did the autonomic nervous system intervene, forcefully making you breathe inspiring? Is because the blood tasters, the chemoreceptors tasting the blood, and ensuring that this blood is not acidic. So if the blood is acidic, then your autonomic nervous system is going to, stop. It means your autonomic nervous system is going to override to protect you from acidosis, because acidosis is a major lethal concern. So that's why there is a breaking point. So you do have a voluntary control. You know, in the yoga, you say yoga, take a deep breath. So that shows you do have a voluntary control. But if you abuse that voluntary control, then a breaking point will lead your autonomic nervous system to counter the carbon dioxide levels that are rising to a point where autonomic control, you see even they put automatic. It's not automatic, it's autonomic control over by your will. Boyle's law. Who remembers Boyle's law? Who can state for us Boyle's law? Boyle's law states that
Constant temperature with the pressure.
at constant temperature, the relationship between
Volume and pressure.
volume and pressure will be inverse. And we utilize that for our breathing. For our pumping of blood, do we need that? Do we need volume and pressure changes? No, because we have a pump. You know your heart pump? When it contracts, the volume goes. When your heart contracts, the volume of your heart goes up or down?
In the heart?
Yeah,
Go down. Volume go down.
it goes down. That means the pressure went. That's why when you squeeze, you make the pressure go down. I'm sorry, you make the volume go down, but the pressure goes. Even with the syringe, you push in on the syringe, so you make the pressure high, but the volume of the syringe becomes
Down.
low. That's Boyle's law. And Boyle's law is what we talked about earlier. In Boyle's law, it's like a barrel. You expand, you see the arrows? The arrows here show you that when you expand to the outside, the transverse diameter The volume goes up, pressure went down, air smoothly moves in the lung. But the opposite, when I shrink, when the volume goes down, the pressure goes up. Relaxed breathing is a passive process achieved mainly by elastic recoil of the thoracic cage, and forced breathing is accessory muscles that raise intrapulmonary pressure as high as plus 40 centimeters. Now, remember when we discussed in the circulatory system that there are variables that increase resistance of blood flow. You know, it's the same. Airflow, blood flow. Blood flowing inside blood vessels and air is flowing inside airways. Both are fluids. The blood is a fluid and air is a fluid. So we have hemodynamics and we have airflow dynamics. What were the factors that increase resistance in blood vessels? Who remembers? What are the factors that increase blood resistance inside the blood vessel?
Hardening. The hardening
The hardening of what?
of the vessel.
So the hardening of vessels like atherosclerosis or arteriosclerosis, when the blood vessel is defected because of a fat plaque or because of high blood pressure, the blood vessel becomes weaker because the blood is pumping so much, or because of an aneurysm. That's one reason. What's another reason that increases the blood? What's another reason that increases the blood resistance, the resistance to blood flow? We said the viscosity. Excellent. That's why sedentary people that don't move a lot, that work in offices, sitting down all the time, compared to construction workers who are constantly running or moving, whose blood is moving rapidly? The mover, the one who moves a lot. But the sedentary people, their blood moves so slowly, it tends to clump up together to make blood clots. We also talk about smoking. Smoking causes exuberant negative feedback release of blood from the bone marrow to compensate for the drop in oxygen saturation in the blood. What about blood vessel length? Talk about the longer the blood vessel, the more resistance. Now, in the airway, we don't have cholesterol in the airway. We don't have cholesterol in the airways. But we have asthma. We have hypersensitivity because you know the cartilage of your trachea is not just cartilage. It's cartilage and there's smooth muscle around it, right? Remember the C, we said the C-section? We said the C-shaped cartilage, it has a muscle that covers it. What's the name of that muscle called? We talked about it right here. The name of the muscle. We showed it to you earlier. You passed it? It was in the trachea. It was in the trachea.
It's in the bottom right side. Right, because just use right there.
Yeah. You see? That's the C-shaped cartilage. And what is that? That's the trachealis muscle that connects it. Now this muscle, if it's hyperspasm, it makes tight the airways, and that causes difficulty breathing, dyspnea. So now that's one of the reasons for the airflow resistance. Okay, we discussed the Boyle's law, and we said that expiration is relaxed. Why do we say expiration is relaxed? Because the diaphragm relaxes. Remember, we said the diaphragm is like a rubber band. It contracts to move down to increase the volume of the respiratory system. And then when you want to exhale, it relaxes back. So exhalation is not a problem. Exhalation is when you allow the balloon to relax. The problem is in the inhalation, when you're stretching out the rib cage, when you're stretching out the diaphragm. But when you relax them, they go right back to where they were. Now, we discussed the anatomical dead space. I mentioned that earlier. What's the dead space? Why they call it dead space? Because there is no respiration. There is no business exchange. Now, the alveoli is alive, a living state. True or false? The alveoli is a living space because the alveoli allows diffusion of oxygen from the alveoli to the blood, and allows for diffusion of carbon dioxide from the blood to from the blood into the alveoli. Now, there is a physiological dead space and there is an anatomical dead space. The anatomical dead space meaning that it's structurally and anatomically meant to be not able to perform gas exchange. It's meant to be. That's why they call it anatomical dead space. Sorry?
What's the difference in both of them?
Yeah, we get into the physiological dead space. That's the sum of the anatomic dead space and any pathological alveolar dead space. Now, physiological dead space, it means that something is wrong with the alveoli, like the nicotine, or like the disease where the alpha-1 antitrypsin, where you lose, remember the great type 2 alveolar cells that secrete the surfactant. Now, some people have a disease, they don't secrete the surfactant. That's now a physiological dead space because it's not meant to be. It's meant to be alive. It's meant to be respiratory gas exchange space. Is that clear? Is that clear? So, is that clear to you? Okay. You have to understand that anatomical dead space is a space where there is meant to be no exchange, like the oral cavity, the trachea, the bronchiole is a conducting zone. It's not an exchange. It's not a respiratory zone. The alveoli is supposed to be a respiratory zone. When the alveoli, the respiratory zone, is now there is a disease like alcohol induced or nicotine or vape or emphysema or COPD or bronchitis or asthma. Now there is a problem with the alveoli, fibrosis. The alveoli that is meant to be able to perform the gas exchange, when the alveoli is destroyed, now that's not anatomical dead space. Now that's physiological dead space. So that's when the alveoli are destroyed, when they are damaged with different diseases.
Thank you.
Clear?
Thank you.
Respiratory volumes and capacities. Anybody here underwent a spirometry? Anybody underwent a spirometry? So now, if you look at your lung, remember in the past, we discussed that when your heart contracts, does it empty every single ounce of blood out? No, there's a little bit that remains. Same thing with the lungs. When you exhale out, do you remove every single bit of air out of the lungs? No. So now, in order to see how efficient are you, your ability to bring in air and exhale air, there's a test known as lung volume and capacities. There are different volumes that your lung can have and different capacities. What are the volumes and capacities? Obviously, volumes and capacities, all of them are going to be related to what? To inhalation and exhalation. Inspiration and expiration. There is a inspiratory volume, inspiratory capacity, expiratory volume, expiratory capacity. Now, let us look. You see, now you go to the doctor, the pulmonologist puts this spirometer and tells you, take a deep breath. When you take a deep breath, he's measuring your inspiratory volume, inspiratory reserve volume. How much air is able to completely fill the lungs? This is the inspiratory reserve volume. Now, let's look at this. This diagram explains for you all the volumes and capacities. Do you see the yellow region? This diagram is very important. Please make sure you pay close attention. You see this yellow region in the middle? This yellow region represents your tidal volume. What's the tidal volume? You know, have you ever seen in the beach, the water moves back and forth, like a tide, So you're breathing at rest, you're breathing normally, in, out. That's known as tidal breathing. So that's why you see it oscillate up and down. So your lung volume can fill up with 3,000 milliliters, which is 3 liters. Your lung can naturally fill with 3 liters of air. But you will be at 2,500, 2 liters and a half. So when you're performing tidal breathing, you're gaining 500 milliliters, losing 500 milliliters. Gaining 500 milliliters, losing 500 milliliters. Gaining 500, that's what we're doing now. That's what you're doing right now. As you're sitting and paying attention to the lecture, you're gaining 500 milliliters, exhaling 500 milliliters. Gaining 500, losing 500. Gaining 500, losing 500. Then who can tell me what happened here? What did the doctor tell this patient? Because look at the volume. The volume now dropped below 2,500 down to 1,100. What do you think happened here? I'm sorry?
Go ahead and say it more.
Exhale. So the doctor told the patient, exhale as hard as you can. Then breathe normally. It went right back up. Now you see a jump up. And you see now the lung of the patient was full of 6,000 milliliters of air. So what did the doctor tell the patient to do here? Inhale as much as you can. Then he told him, exhale as much as you can. Then breathe normally. Then inhale as much as you can. Exhale out as much as you can. So, in order for you to be able to interpret this chart, the tidal volume represents the amount of air coming in and out at rest. If you look now into the residual volume, what does residual volume mean? From the name, residual volume represents the air that is residual, residing inside the lung and never coming out, no matter how much you exhale. That's called residual volume. How much is residual volume? About 1100, about a liter and 100 milliliters. Tidal volume, 500, up and down. So the tidal volume is about 500. Residual volume is 1100. Expiratory reserve volume is, from the name, expiratory reserve volume is when you're exhaling as hard as you can. You see? You're exhaling as hard as you can. And how much is the expiratory reserve volume? It's from 1100 to 2500. So 2500 minus 1100, that comes out to 1400 milliliters. That's your expiratory reserve volume. Inspiratory reserve volume, take in as much air in as possible. That goes from 3,000 to 6,000, which shows about, it has a capacity of 3,000 milliliters, or 3 liters. And the total lung capacity is the sum of all the capacities. Your inspiratory reserve, your inspiratory capacity. The inspiratory capacity includes both the tidal volume and the inspiratory reserve volume. The vital capacity includes everything except the residual volume. And the functional residual capacity is the sum of the residual volume and the expiratory reserve volume. Any questions? That is spirometry. So it's the measurement of the pulmonary function, and that's what helps us discover restrictive and obstructive lung disorders. What's the difference between obstructive pulmonary disease and a restrictive pulmonary disease? Who can tell me the difference between obstructive pulmonary disease and restrictive pulmonary disease? Obstructive pulmonary disease meaning air cannot come out. Obstructive, out. Obstructive pulmonary disease means air cannot come out. Air is obstructed from coming out. So those people will have what kind of pH? So if they have obstruction, so air cannot come out, they will be having what? Obstruction, air cannot come out. So air comes in, I take a deep breath, but his air is not coming out. What is that? Acidosis. Because who's supposed to come out? Carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide cannot come out. So it stays in. So patients with COPD, obstructive diseases, they will always have acidosis. Restrictive diseases means that air cannot go in. Those that reduce pulmonary compliance, they limit the amount to which the lungs can be inflated. You see, restrictive diseases means that the air cannot inflate the lungs. Any disease that produces pulmonary fibrosis and blood lung disease, tuberculosis, that's diseases So patients who have restrictive pulmonary diseases, they always suffer from what? So restrictive pulmonary diseases, they always suffer from inability of oxygen to go inside the lung. So that means they will always have hypoxemia. They will not have enough oxygen. They will always be bluish. Cyanosis. They will have cyanosis. Obstructive disorders, those that interfere with airflow by blocking entry, air coming in. Example would be asthma, chronic bronchitis, emphysema. Now, you need to know the names of these terminologies. Eupnea is relaxed, quiet breathing. Apnea is temporary cessation of breathing. Dyspnea. Dyspnea meaning difficult. You see the word dys, D-Y-S all the time. D-Y-S, D-Y-S, D-Y-S. Dyspnea means difficulty. Like dysphagia, you can't swallow well. Dysuria, you can urinate well. Dyspnea, you can breathe easily. Difficulty, always difficulty. Hyperpnea, increased rate and depth of breathing. Hyperventilation, increased pulmonary ventilation. Hypoventilation is reduced pulmonary ventilation leading to an increase in blood carbon dioxide. Kussmaul respiration is deep, rapid breathing often induced by acidosis. Respiratory arrest is the permanent cessation of breathing. And tachypnea is the accelerated respiration. This question was $150,000 on the Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. Anybody know who wants to be a millionaire? So this question was there. The question asked, what is the gas that makes up the predominant weight of the atmosphere? Was it oxygen? Was it nitrogen? Was it hydrogen? Or was it carbon dioxide? The guy thought it was oxygen because we breathe oxygen. So he said it's oxygen, he lost all the money. The answer is what? Nitrogen. So nitrogen makes up about 78%, oxygen 20%, carbon dioxide 0.04, and the rest is water vapor and mixed with other gases. Now, this is a new law. We talked about Boyle's law. Now, this is not Boyle, that's Dalton's law. What is Dalton's telling you? Dalton's law says the total atmospheric pressure is the sum of the contributions of the individual gases. So, for example, if you have a salad, you put 10 grams of tomato, 1 gram of cucumber, 1 gram of lettuce, 1 gram of olives. Who's going to be the predominant weight? The tomatoes. Because you put more of that. So the law is telling you the same. That, remember, who did we say was the most in air? It was nitrogen. So what was the weight of nitrogen in air? 78%. So that is its partial pressure. So when you take a deep breath, the air that went in, who do you think is going to be 78% of the air inside your stomach? Inside your stomach, inside your liver, inside your lungs, inside your lung, is nitrogen. Because it was 78% on the outside, it's going to be 78% on the inside. So the law says, the total atmospheric pressure is the sum of the contributing partial pressures of the individual gases that make it up. So, we are supposedly at sea level. So at sea level, 1 atmospheric pressure equals to 760 millimeters of mercury. But I know that the 760 millimeters of mercury, 78% of that is who? So nitrogen is going to be 78% times 760 millimeters of mercury. That means at sea level, nitrogen is worth how much? 597 millimeters of mercury in it, of your atmospheric pressure. Oxygen was 20, so 20% of 760 millimeters of mercury is 159. Partial pressure of water is 0.5. And when you add all of them with carbon dioxide, when you add all of them, you end up with 760. So your pressure in air is equal to your concentration in the air. That's the Dalton's law. The question?
No, because I'm thinking that you would be using the percentage out of it.
If you be easy to
What
do
I'm saying is it would be easy to take a percentage out of it, it's still gonna be 760 because you're,
I don't understand what you're saying.
I said that you're just taking the percentage out of it, and it's gonna be adding up to 760.
Yeah, but he's proving to you, Dalton is proving to you his theory that if you look at the total atmospheric pressure, you see that because nitrogen was 78.6%, the pressure of air, 78% of it is caused by nitrogen. You understand? Because 78% of the gas in air is nitrogen and 20% of the gas in air is oxygen, then 20% of the pressure of air will be due to oxygen and 78% of the pressure of air is due to the nitrogen. So that's the relationship between it's like when you're in the elevator. A 100-pound person walks in. A 200-pound person walks in. A 300-pound person walks in. And a 400-pound person walks in. The 4 go inside. I have my weight. Okay? I'm 300 pounds. I'm 300 out of the sum of everybody. So my pressure is how much. So the total pressure on the elevator is the sum of our individual partial pressures. So same thing in the air. So that's telling you if you have a cup of water, if you take a breath in the lung, nitrogen will always be 78%. Whether in air, whether in a cup of water, whether in a big barrel of water, whether in the ocean, whether in your lung, because it is the predominant, that's how much it weighs on an earth. So Dalton's law tells you that the total pressure equals the sum of all the people in the elevator, the sum of all the gases in air. The total pressure is a mixture of gases, is the sum of the partial pressure of each gas. Now Henry came in. Henry said, Boyle's has a law, Dalton has a law, I want my law too. So Henry says, is talking about the diffusion, which I just alluded to with a cup of water. The gas diffuses down their own concentration gradient until the partial pressure of each gas in air is equal to the partial pressure in water. So Henry's law says, at the air-water interface, for a given temperature, the amount of the gas that dissolves in water is determined by its solubility in water and its partial pressure in the air. So just because you have a high partial pressure in air, it doesn't mean you will dissolve in water. Because I can have a cup of water and a cup of oil, and I measure nitrogen in both, is it going to be the same? It's not, because even though nitrogen is 78%, nitrogen can dissolve in water, but it doesn't have a solubility coefficient for oil. So now Henry introduced the solubility, that you need both. You need a concentration for a pressure gradient, and you need a solubility gradient. So the greater the pressure for oxygen in the alveolar air, the more oxygen the blood is going to pick. So when you take a deep breath, the more oxygen in the lung, the more oxygen will go in the red blood cells. And the blood arriving on the alveolus has a high partial pressure for carbon dioxide than air. The carbon dioxide is going to go in the opposite direction. You will know that in the explanation. That shows you here, Henry's law. It's telling you that if you have a lot of gas in the air and you put a cup of water, they will reach equilibrium. Amount of air, the gas in the air is going to stop to dissolve in the cup until there's equilibrium between gas in air and gas in water or blood, whatever that was there. Same thing for carbon dioxide. There will always be an equilibrium. We discussed that. You see, you went over that. I drew that. Remember? There is a external respiration. Air comes in. Look at the partial pressure for air coming in. For oxygen, 159. For carbon dioxide, 0.30. You see a high partial pressure here. In the lung, what's the partial pressure for oxygen? 104. So you see the air went from 159 to 104 to 95 in the heart to ultimately 40 in the tissue. Do you see? You see the numbers going down? 159, 104, 95, 40. That shows the oxygen goes from an area of a high pressure, 159, to low pressure, 104, lower pressure, 95, low pressure, 40. And carbon dioxide is 46 in tissue. Now you go up, it's 46, reach into the heart, then it's 32. So where is carbon dioxide higher? In the tissue or in the atmosphere? In the tissue, so carbon dioxide left to the atmosphere. So that shows you what happens to the alveoli. In a healthy person, you see the blues. In a person with pneumonia, you see there's a lot of fluid and blood cells and edema and infiltrate and granuloma tissue and pus. But in emphysema, you see there is a confluent alveoli that is destroyed. So membrane edema in the left ventricular failure causes edema and thickening of the membrane. We talked about that in heart failure. Pneumonia causes thickening of the respiratory membrane due to the pus generation in the granuloma tissue. Okay, talking about hemoglobin. There's oxyhemoglobin that is bound, oxygen is bound to hemoglobin, and then deoxyhemoglobin, hemoglobin with no oxygen. So from the name, oxyhemoglobin is oxygen bound to hemoglobin, and deoxyhemoglobin is hemoglobin with no oxygen. Talking about the gases exchange. And this shows you that not all the oxygen is carried by the red blood cell. There is some oxygen that is dissolved in the tissue, some oxygen dissolved in plasma, some carbon dioxide. Not every carbon dioxide. You see, some carbon dioxide is dissolved in the blood. Some carbon dioxide is found in the red blood cell. Some oxygen is in the red blood cell, and some oxygen is dissolved in the blood. So don't think that every little oxygen and carbon dioxide is only found in the red blood cell. The majority are, but some of them. Ketoacidosis. This acidosis is brought about by rapid fat oxidation, releasing acidic ketone body. See, this is in diabetes mellitus. Please remember that Kussmaul respiration is a sign that indicates hyperventilation to reduce carbon dioxide, meaning that there is acidosis. Partial pressure of oxygen usually has little effect on respiration. And there's chronic hypoxemia, where the partial pressure of oxygen is less than 16 when you put it. Chronic bronchitis represents a severe persistent inflammation of the lower respiratory tract, and goblet cells enlarge and produce excess mucus, immobilize cilia, they fail to remove mucus, and there's thick, stagnant mucus that is ideal for bacterial growth. Okay, we talked about smoking and lung cancer. 90% originating in the mucous membrane of the large bronchi. We discussed how nicotine prevents the unloading of oxygen from the red blood cell into the tissue. And you see now this is what happens to a smoker's lung. And the lung tissue first develops metaplasia in order to keep up with this lung, with this stress, nicotine stress. And lastly, there is this cancer anaplasia, because the stress has been too severe, leading to damage beyond salvage. Are there any questions? Okay, let's take the attendance. We take a break. I'll see you at 4:30 in the lab.